Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. So this is a pre-intro to the episode you're about to listen. This is the first time I do a pre-intro, so if you like it, ping me, leave a comment on the site if you're listening this on the site, or just ping me on Twitter, Duarte_Vasco, Duarte_VASCO, and let me know what you think of this pre-intro. So with us today, we have two very special people that have been very active in the estimate and no estimates communities, Dan Vacanti and Marcus Hammarberg. Dan Vacanti is a 20-plus year software industry veteran who's been most of the last years focusing on Lean and Agile practices. In 2007, he helped to develop the Kanban Method for knowledge work. He also co-created ActionableAgile, which we will talk about in this episode quite a bit. And this is a tool that provides industry-leading predictive analytic tools and services to anyone using Lean and Agile processes. Dan also co-founded prokanban.org, a community-focused initiative to help people learn about Kanban. We also have with us Marcus Hammarberg. Marcus is the author of Salvation, the Bungsu Story, which is available on Amazon, which is an inspiring and actionable story about how simple tools can help transform the productivity and impact of an organization. He has real-life stories in the Bungsu, which is a real hospital in Indonesia, and those stories are about how you can help transform the productivity of your team. Marco has also authored Kanban in Action with Joachim Sundén, and he is the head of curriculum at the School of Applied Technology. So that's as a busy person we have with us. So now on to the show and to talk about predictions and no estimates. Hello everybody, welcome to a very special episode, a bonus episode no less, and today, a bonus for me. I have with me Dan Vacanti and Marcus Hammarberg. Hi, guys. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Vasco.
Hey, Vasco.
So it's a pleasure to talk about a topic that for many of our listeners know that is close to my heart, that is no estimates. And we've actually done an episode on no estimates quite a while back, all the way back to 2020 February. So even before COVID in most of the world. It was already in China at that time, but most of the world was kind of absent-minded about the topic. Anyway, it was 2020 with Marcus Hammarberg, and you'll find the link on the show notes. And we actually want to start this conversation with Marcus because he recently published a post on LinkedIn that started with what you would call a programmer productivity experience. Yeah. And I really like that because I think it's an anecdote, it's a story that happened to him, so it's a first-hand account of that story, and I think it explains why project management and indeed estimation, the estimation part of the, time control, I think it is, in project management, doesn't actually apply to knowledge work. Now, I know I'm making a bold claim, but let's hear the story first, and then we can have that discussion. So, Marcus, tell us a little bit more about what you wrote in that article.
Yes, I will. Super happy to be on this pod, by the way, and to meet you, Dan. It's not really face-to-face, but close to. So I'm super happy and proud to be here. Yeah, so the thing is, I'm working right now as an instructor. I'm writing courses. And I ended up writing a course on a topic that I haven't used for a while, so it took me some time to do, and I had to dig into it. And I had this realization that this reminds me so much about how it is to write code, because I started to research something. I found a good idea about how I wanted to structure this week of slides and exercises that I wanted the developers to do. And after a while, it just got harder and harder for me to write, and I didn't find any help, and I just ended up in like, this is not the way, this cannot be the way to do it. And I realized that I've started in the wrong end. So after about 3 days, I was writing. I don't remember if I wrote that or not, but I think I was writing 1 or 2 days worth of material. And 3 days in, I just realized that this is not the way to do it. I made a wrong assumption in the beginning, so I had to.
Sounds like many projects to me.
Yeah, right. So I had to go back and just throw the whole thing out and start off from the beginning again. And all of a sudden, when I to be quite honest, I used the "Who Wants to be a Millionaire" trick and called a friend. But once I had that help, he basically just said, "Well, you should nowadays we do this instead," and he showed me something. And I got started on that, and I could rewrite the whole thing in just 1 or 2 days more. But it was such a realization for me that because this is like this was the last week I wrote. So every week has just been moving on in a steady pace. As long as I got time to write it, I knew how fast I was going. And then all of a sudden I hit this brick wall where it just went slower and slower, and I just realized after a while, I will never finish this. I don't know how to. I know now how to get to the end of this. So rather than take the normal 2 days to write the day, it took me actually 6 days to finish one day, and it was such an interesting realization in a totally different world, because I'm normally helping the teams to develop code or writing code myself. But here I had the exactly same thing. And I think you're brushing on one of my biggest realizations the last couple of years, which has to do with we are applying lean thinking, and agile is like in many regards based on lean. And then someone asked me once, like, lean, isn't that for manufacturing? And I said, yeah, exactly, it is. So how can you do that? And I was taken aback a little bit, right? What do you mean? But then he explained what he meant, because he said, what you are doing is actually developing. You are making one out of something that has never existed before. Whereas manufacturing is about making many out of something that you have done many times before to the lowest possible cost. Just happens to be that lean thinking can actually help you with that. But for me, that's a big realization. Like software development, or as you said, Vasco, knowledge work is not manufacturing. It's actually discovery, developing, making mistakes, learning, and then adjusting to that learning. And that's how you want. So that's my. I maybe I should have called it something like product unproductivity or something like that. But yeah, because it was really the brick wall I hit rather than the productivity issue. But I just recognized the feeling so much.
So Dan, you wrote a tool, the ActionableAgile tool, and in writing that tool, you actually help people kind of use data to look at, how are we progressing? How is this going to end, or when is it going to end, if that's the question that people want to ask? How do you look at this? Like specifically this example of, let's call it programmer productivity. In this case, it was head of curriculum productivity to the disciplines of project planning and project estimation.
Yeah. So first, like Marcus, I want to say thanks so much for having me on. Although you've had this podcast for how long, Vasco? And this is the first
7 years.
And this
is
I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm just going to do with that what you. And Marcus, of course, the pleasure is all mine. It's great to finally kind of have a chat with you. Yeah. I don't necessarily want to focus too much on the tool side of things, and maybe more on the principle side of things. And for me, it's one of the biggest problems, I think, with agile practitioners, for lack of a better word, is so many in our industry think of the world as deterministic, right? It's like we can, not only can we know, we should know how long something's going to take. And there was all this stuff that maybe we'll talk about, maybe we won't, that has crept up around this deterministic assumption. And I think, as everybody on this show very well knows, the world is not deterministic. It's very much probabilistic in nature. And so that means we have to take a probabilistic approach, a statistical approach. And so, in Marcus's case, or in any case like Marcus's, for me, the thing is looking for that signal that, hey, this is kind of outside the ordinary. we're going to quickly get into language of Short and Deming here, but we expect, routine variation and we expect certain things, but at some point, we're outside the realm of routine and we're into more of the exceptional. And so that's really where I like to focus my attention is, how do we get that signal? Because as Marcus said, I mean, he sat down, he's like, this is going to take a couple of days, no problem, right? I'm going to have this thing nailed in a couple of days. A couple of days later, he still doesn't have it. And so that's really where I like to focus is where at what point do we get that signal that, hey, this is not going the way that we expect it to, we maybe need to try something different.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. Like, how do we get the signal that things aren't going as we expect them to go? That may be actually a very nice way to save a phase of project estimation and even indeed programmer productivity. Because if you accept that, then it's okay to, spend some time, perhaps even too much, in my opinion, on estimates. Because once you get the signal, you know to throw them away. Right? Because what I think is one of the biggest anti-patterns with estimation is exactly this. I would go a little bit beyond what Dan said. So Dan said there's this expectation that the world is deterministic. Okay, that's already a problem with estimates because it isn't. The world is never deterministic beyond a very, very narrow frame, like, for example, the laws of physics or something like that, right? But once we go beyond that, now we start to think about, okay, so what happens when things don't happen as we expect? And we are all familiar with the very common anti-pattern that when estimates don't work, blame the programmer. So Marcus, it's your fault, right?
So it often is, I have to say. But hey.
I didn't want to say it, but I'm glad somebody did.
Yeah, exactly. I love to be the bad example in this show.
If we now take this a little bit further, I would say that this whole expectation that we know how long it takes is a big problem because it prevents us from even wanting to get the signal that Dan is talking about, right? Like it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of doom because we know it's going to be wrong, but we still want to stick to it, right? So I think we need to move on and start talking about not only how to get the signal, and I'm sure Dan will come up with some ideas and tools that we can use for that, but also what do we do when we get the signal, right? So I have my own perspective on how to get the signal, but Marcus has in the article something that I think is important to talk about, which is how to keep the stakeholders aware of what's going on and inform them when, the proverbial hits the fan. Because Marcus, you were 2 days into a 2-day project and you discovered you had 0.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are people waiting for you, right? So how did you keep that? Like, because that's also one of the cool things in the article. How do you bring that to the stakeholders?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is such an important thing to say. Like, what is it allowed to say that I'm late? Or how will that be received? So what I did, we are quite a small company actually, so I just wanted to let my co-workers know what happens if they kept pulling me into other projects, because I knew that I needed to write this. I actually need to write 63 days worth of slides and labs, and we had a starting date for the course, so I knew exactly when it's gonna go live. And I knew here's a big caveat from that is different from doing software development, for example, is that I knew exactly what I needed to do as well. I had 63 days worth of work to produce, right? So what I did, largely based on your work, Dan, I learned so much from your books and from the Agile tool that you, estimation tool that you had. Actionable metrics, is that what it's called?
ActionableAgile, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I brought it into Spotify. They used it a lot there. So yeah, that was and I've learned so much from that. So what I ended up doing was that I just listed all the days in a long row, and then I gave them like a status per each, which I made up, which is basically like I've written the heading. I've written the heading for the exercise. I've actually written the slides. I've written this. So it was like a very easy little progress report per day. And then I went from I started to do percentage per day, how much was it completed, but in the end I just basically went from it was 15%, which was just like I initialized the day in a structure, to 100%. I was totally done. So I didn't report anything else than that. It was 1 or 0, basically. And by doing that, and by having the start and end date of each item, I could very easily start to create a forecast here based on some super simple math. And I've described that in the blog post how you could do that. So I could actually start to tell my stakeholders that with the tempo that I have right now, what's going to happen is that we're going to release this course. In the worst case, we're going to release this course 6 months after it's due to start. The likely case is that we're 2 months late. And in the best of worlds, if it continues like this, we're actually going to release it on time. Because that was the time when I got pulled in to do another course for 2 weeks straight, and I got 0 work done. And that very, very quickly reflected on my prognosis, of course. And then I started, once I got back to doing work, I started to work, continue to work, and these prognosis, and I think it's called, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's called the cone of uncertainty, meaning the wideness of how the difference between worst case and best case, that became much more narrow the more I learned. In the words of Woody Sully, it's in doing the work we discover the work we need to do. So it's in doing the work I also discovered how fast I will actually move going on forward. So I geeked out totally and even created a little animated GIF for them to show how my progress changed over time. But it was actually a very, very interesting way to communicate, and so easy to set up as well, because you only need the start and end date, so you know how long each item took. And from that, it was very simple for me to calculate. In the best of days, in some best days, I might complete 3 days of a course in 1 day. In the worst days, yeah, you heard about that. It was not even a fifth of a day in one day. And I could easily calculate how prognosis of when it will be done and stuff like that. So that I had great use of that, and I think that it was a very good way to communicate with the people around me as well. It's much easier to show and say see what happened here when I ran this course. My progress flatlined, but not only that, the prognosis of the worst case is totally devastated by this, and we're not going to make it.
So Dan, you've done a lot of work on this, right? Presenting data to stakeholders, how to communicate potential release dates or particular points in time that are linked to the work that we need to do. So you have a lot of experience with this. So what have you learned and also incorporated into your tool, ActionableAgile, that helps us to communicate this kind of information as Marcus described?
Yeah, if I'm being completely honest, and I say this all the time in my trainings, if I had a great answer to how to communicate this information to stakeholders, I honestly wouldn't be talking to you people. I mean, I love you both to death, but I'd be on a beach somewhere counting all my money, whatever. But this is one nut that I haven't cracked yet, because not only do we need to teach teams how to think in some of the ways that we were talking about earlier, but we also need to teach our stakeholders to consume the information that is coming off of these teams.
That's true.
And it's a giant exercise in risk management. And the problem is, in Agile, you can't say risk management because that doesn't sound sexy, and that starts to sound project managey and whatever. But that's really what it is. All this uncertainty that Marcus was talking about is risk. Right. And so we need to talk about it in risk terms. A lot of industries have really have figured out this risk or not figured out this risk, depending on how you think about it. To me, that's the problem we need to solve. And Marcus gave a great example, and he's like worst case scenario, it's going to be 6 months late. Best case scenario, it's going to be just right on time. Well, the thing is, the chances of it being exactly 6 months late, pretty close to zero. The chances of it being exactly on time, pretty close to zero. But the chances of it falling somewhere between that 6 months and exactly on time, the chances of it falling somewhere in there, pretty high.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. We need to talk about this in terms of what is the range of possible outcomes and what is our probability of falling within that range. And if we don't like any of those answers, then we need to do something, right? We need to do something about it. And this is where all the classic project management stuff comes in. Do we cut scope? Do we add people? Do we, change the requirement? Do we, whatever we need to do. So I don't know. I'm waving my hands. This is a podcast. I'm waving my hands a lot. So
I love that answer, especially because you talk about something that is very close to my heart, of course, that is risk management. And this brings us kind of to the core topic of this episode, right? Which is what Marcus calls in his article, the prognosis, or using data to create a forecast and therefore assess what's the likely outcome, as Dan just explained. And here I'd like to introduce a simple yet similar approach that to Marcus's, which I call the Disneyland Heuristic, right? Like if you're 700 kilometers away from Disneyland and you travel at 100 kilometers an hour, you're going to be there in about 7 hours, period. Of course, if you stop for a wee and, you travel with children, they feel bad, they feel car sick, you need to stop or whatever, then it's probably going to be more than 7 hours, right? But that's a very simple heuristic, right? And when we talk about teaching our teams and our stakeholders how to use this information, I think we need to go back to this basic idea that if you don't know what your average speed is, no matter what the distance might be, you never know when you're going to be there, right? And in the best case, estimates is about knowing the distance to the end. It's not about knowing the speed of progress, right? So, for example, let's say we take a backlog and we estimate it all into whatever, like 5s and 3s and 8s and whatever story points, if that's what you prefer, or SM and L and XL or whatever. That only tells you how far you need to go to reach your destination, right? Like deliver the items in the backlog. But it doesn't tell you how fast you can go through them. That again comes back to the idea that Dan just mentioned. That's a probabilistic assessment that needs data to be created. You can't say that I will do all of the S's in 2 days or all of the M's in one sprint. You can't say that because some M's will actually turn out to be XLs and some S's will actually be so simple they shouldn't even be an item in the backlog. So this is, for me, one of the key core aspects of the whole no estimates conversation is that we need to apply the Disneyland heuristic, but for that we need to create the data that allows us to use the Disneyland heuristic. And let's start with Dan next. So you've been working on this problem for many years. What have you learned from the working on this problem and even creating the tool about helping teams to understand these two aspects that come together when we talk about knowing when we are going to be done?
I think it's more about understanding the pitfalls. I think that you're kind of mentioning there, Vasco, and even things like talking about averages, get us into trouble because it's one of my, Marcus, you're probably familiar with this, and Vasco, you probably are too. One of my favorite references is a book called The Flaw of Averages by Dr. Sam Savage. And because a lot of people, Vasco, I think what they do is they try to replace data with just average. They're like, I kind of on average know what I'm doing. And the whole point of the flaw of averages, if you can sum it up in one sentence, is that, plans based on average fail on average. They also succeed on average, but they fail on average too. So if you're planning based on average, you have about an average chance of succeeding. And so my point being is, I think a lot of teams don't even know where to start with a lot of this stuff, and they quickly kind of fall into some of these pitfalls, like assuming complexity is a good predictor of how long something is going to take. That's a terrible assumption. Assuming that we can know on average how fast we're going and therefore predict based on that average, terrible assumption. And I think that's where most people stumble. But it's hard because everything that we've come up, I'll probably lump myself in this, everything we've come up in Agile kind of reinforces that thinking.
It's not just Agile though. Like this is one of the fundamental theoretical bases of estimation. Sure. Is exactly that we can know with reasonable certainty the distance and the average speed.
I just like to pick on Agile people.
So if I can chime in here, I think one thing that is so important that you mentioned there, Dan, is that if you have a span between two extremes and then plot out a middle or something but if you have a span, an area, we can say with reasonable certainty that the next item will fall within that area, for example. But if you start to think exactly what you said now about an average, you realize that that's just one dot within that field. You're going to say like 62.8, that's what it's going to be. Where with a span and an area, if you visualize a diagram or something like that, you can realize like, oh, okay, so it's going to be in between here. And back to what you said before, I found that to be much easier to communicate with stakeholders, showing a span that it will most likely fall within, than to say like, yeah, so we think that we're crunching like 14.6 story points per sprint. And and off we go, right? Because that conversation becomes so hard, because we know that if you say something exactly, like an average is in a way an exact number, right? It will an average, if you take a large amount of values and then say the average of it, it will be an exact number, and people will take that number as the truth and run with it. A field or a cone of uncertainty like that is much more reasonable to express the uncertainty we have, I think, and it's easier to communicate as well.
Dan wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just Vasco, as a follow up to this, because I don't. This is outside this conversation, but I'd love to do a follow up podcast on the psychology of presenting people with data, because everybody likes to think that they're empirical. Everybody likes to think that they're rational. But when we present this information, these cold hard facts to people, they behave in very, very, very unpredictable ways. So anyway, the whole psychology. That's
and my favorite reaction is, that's not realistic.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, I can see the future, and it's not in the future. Wow,
Yeah.
How is that even possible? Okay, so we started talking about this interval. You called it a span, Marcus, but basically an interval, right? Like, best case, worst case, it's going to end somewhere in the middle. We don't know exactly where, but we can even give you, if we use enough data, we can even give you kind of a sense of the likelihood of where it's going to land, right? Like, it's this whole interval, but it might land more likely in this smaller part of this bigger interval. Now, obviously, for those that understand enough about probabilities or statistics, they might get what that means. But if you go to the average manager and the average project manager, they will, even though you might couch it in those terms, they will still look at it and say it's that date. Mm-hmm. Because here's the thing, the world out there is not a continuum, right? It's stochastic. So it's either going to be on, Friday, or for those of you doing continuous delivery into production, you're probably going to release on Thursday, not Friday. So it's going to be on Thursday or Monday. It's not going to be on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, because nobody's here to take the calls if something goes wrong, right? So then we now need to translate that span, that interval, into something concrete that means something to our stakeholders. And I would love to do that follow-up about the psychology of presenting people with data, Dan. So let's make sure we book that before we end up our call here.
I'd love to hear that.
But this brings me to the biggest problem, which is, and Dan already mentioned, is that we use estimates so that we don't have to manage the risk of being wrong. And this, for me, is one of the biggest anti-patterns with the whole idea of using estimates to make decisions, right? In other words, if you go to the stock market and you buy a stock, you have a belief, right? And you put a lot of money into it if you have a strong belief, and you put a little bit into it if you have a not so strong belief, right? So we are intuitively able to do that. But when we go to work, we put all of our money on one date, right? Like the outcome of an estimation process. And we have no concept of, is it going to be close to the date or further away from the date? Do we invest all of the people's time into that? Do we, for example, which is what I argue in the No Estimates book, do we, for example, start a proactive scope management process already at the start of the project so that we can react to when, the proverbial hits the fan? Like, how do we bring this conversation to the teams and to the stakeholders that we need to be doing risk management from day zero, not when the estimate is finally shown to be completely wrong, which it will.
Is okay? So that's me. That's to me, this is where we get back to what we were talking about before with so many of our assumptions are based around this notion that we know everything up front. We know complexity up front. We know value up front. We know we know time up front. We know all of these things up front. And and this is where I like. God, I hate to do this in public, but this is where I like to quote a friend and colleague of mine, Pratik Singh, and his thing is the goal is to find out how wrong you are as quickly as possible. Right. Everybody starts with this notion that you're right. You need to start with the notion that you're wrong, because it's more likely that you're wrong. And so we need to find out as quickly as possible how wrong you are. And that's, so when we talk about the tools that I've built, and we talk about, the books that I've written and things like that, it's really around that notion is how do we get people to understand, assume you're wrong up front, and figure out how wrong you are, and then we can take action based on as we uncover that knowledge about how wrong we are.
Yeah, and back to I just want to, speaking on being wrong, I just want to emphasize that I actually went in with that notion into this little project as well, because I realized it's just me. I know my own capacity. I know exactly how much I'm going to build, and still I ended up in problem. Because where after a while it was like, as you said, Vasco, this S here that I'm picking up, or this little day that I thought I would just hash out, it turned out to be a rabbit hole of problems that I didn't really know how to solve. And it took me like 6 or 7 times longer than I thought it would. So even when you think that you have everything under control, it's actually pretty tricky to know that. And it's a much better approach to just realize that you don't, and let's find a process where we quickly can see when it's going south.
And that's a very important point, because a process that assumes you're wrong to start with is going to look different from a process that assumes you're right to start with. And that's why I like Dan's mention of risk management, because the whole idea of the discipline of risk management is to assume up front that we're going to be wrong and therefore plan around it, right? Like we in a risk management perspective, you don't plan to deliver on time, right? You plan to try, but obviously you're ready to take it when it's not happening, right? Like in project management or in software delivery, when we find out that it's not gonna, the product is not gonna be delivered at the right time, then we start taking in actions designed to either bring it back into the original date, or then just accept it's not and then change the strategy, right? That's also a possibility. Risk management doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you how wrong you are, and hopefully it does that quite quickly, to quote Dan's friend.
Yeah, that's why I always come back for a shameless plug. The second book I wrote was When Will It Be Done? I started off by giving a hurricane example, and how they do hurricane forecasting. And the thing is, I live in South Florida, and I can sit here and I can just say all day, I'm like, hey, a hurricane's not going to hit. A hurricane's not going to hit. God, wouldn't it be great if a hurricane doesn't hit? I mean, I can say that all I want, but when the hurricane's barreling down on me, at some point there's action, that I'm going to need to take, despite how I feel about the world, or despite, how positively I want to think.
Yeah. Actually, I think your former president, Mr. Donald Trump, he made a really good example of how those charts work, and why you remember that one when he was adding a little extra at the end.
Yeah.
And you just realized that, okay, so that was stupid, but why really? I've been thinking about this quite a lot. I often use that picture actually in when I talk about Kanban, because so this is the cone of uncertainty. Like the further away, the cone grows bigger. And the more probable, the more likelihood you want into it. If you want like 97% likelihood, okay, so you need to make the cone really, really wide. And what he could have done actually, is to just add the next circle, which would be even bigger, and include the place that he happened to mention. But he didn't. He just added a little loop at the end there, and we all realized that was stupid. But now back to the mirror and take a look at ourselves, because I've heard so many times, like what you said before, like this is not realistic. Can you make it with a higher probability? So what if I want 100% probability? Well, then my friend, the cone need to cover the entire Earth. then we would be 100% sure that the hurricane would hit any of those points, right? But if you want a very narrow point, like exactly on this date, for example, then the probability will have to be super low. It's not likely to happen.
Every time somebody uses the word realistic in the context of software development and product development, I have this urge to say, you keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So this is a very rich topic. I mean, I've been writing about this since 2008. And I don't know when you started then, but I guess about the same time, if not a bit before. Marcus is as well. So we've been writing about this for a long time, and we are constantly discovering new aspects, new perspectives on this topic of when will it be done, as Dan's book is. And by the way, I will put the link on the show notes to that. But that just tells us that we're probably going to have another episode in the near future about this topic again. So before we finish, though, I did want to ask our guests, Marcus and Dan, let's start with Marcus. What's one thing you would like our listeners to take away from this episode?
I've learned most things that I've learned about this. I've learned from you two guys. So I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants here. Although I think I'm taller than the both of them.
Yeah, you are taller.
Not put together, though.
I was going to say put together, maybe even you're taller than both of us.
Yeah. No, but the one thing that has struck me every time I start to do this is that it's not hard to get started. It sounds super advanced, but the thing that I realized that if you track start and stop dates for each item, regardless of size, that will get you so far in producing data that you can talk about and have these kinds of conversations about creating this probabilistic forecast rather than to just say an average or average exact, if you understand what I mean, an exact point in time. So that is my takeaway. Like, just start with tracking the start and stop date per item. Don't mind size to start with, but just do that, and then start to feed that into. I mean, I did it now in Google Sheets, but if you want to have more real data, use Dan's tool, because that's also super easy to use and super gives you all the data that you will ever need. But that will help you to get the conversation started. It's not that hard. And Dan, you will have to help me here, but if I'm remembering from your book correctly, we don't need that much data either in order to start to talk about making some kind of Vasco, realistic forecast there, right? It's just like 5 data points or something like that, as long as they are random. But
depending on the context we're talking about, because you're actually getting into what I wanted to talk about. So somewhere around 10, 11, 12 data points, you can be fairly certain, in as few as that. Once you're up around 20, you're making some assumptions. You know your context pretty well, and that's actually. I don't know, Vasco, if I can give 2 things. I hope I can give 2 things, because I just want to follow on what Marcus said, and then I've got another thing I want to say. But so many people just want to start with the data, and maybe it's because we're engineers, maybe it's because we're trained, mathematically or in an engineering discipline or whatever. They just want to start with data. And the big thing I've learned is it's almost never about the data, almost never. So you should be suspicious of somebody who says, go out and just start with the data. Because it's never about the data. I shouldn't say it's never. It's almost never about the data. It's almost always about the process that generated the data. And so that's really where, in my humble opinion, where you need to start. Now, again, that doesn't sound sexy. Nobody wants to start with process. But if your process is chaotic, if it's crazy, your data will reflect that.
By the way, if I understand you correctly, Dan, you're talking about process in the context of everything that goes into producing what will then generate the data. So, for example, the start-stop date, right? It's, when do you start? Maybe you have sprints or you don't have sprints. Totally different type of data, right? If you have a Kanban flow, the start date is not attached to a particular point in time. but if you're using Scrum, the start date will be attached to a particular point in time, and so will the end date, and so on. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not talking about a specific framework. I'm not saying, oh, you have to go do Kanban or you have to go do Scrum. I'm just talking about what is the system within which we're working in order to produce value for our customers. Yeah. So thank you for making that that clarification. So that's the first thing. It's, once we have some, and I'm going to use the word stabilize, but that word is overloaded in English anyway. But once you've brought some stability to your process, now we can start talking about data as data for predictive value. But this is where I get to the next thing. This is where I think we've taken the train ride all the way around the zoo, maybe all the way around Disneyland, to use your metaphor, Vasco. We've taken the train all the way around Disneyland and come back to the beginning, because it's all about that signal. In my humble opinion, it's all about that signal. And the best tool that I can give anybody starting out with this stuff is the best way to get that signal is to focus on a metric that most people don't even know about and don't even pay attention to. And that's age, work item age. How long have we been working on something? So getting back to Marcus's original example, now this is the first time he'd ever done something. So he didn't have any data before that he could look at. So he, it was probably really hard for him. I'm assuming stuff, Marcus, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
You're bang on target.
Yeah. So it was really hard for him to know, well, what's reasonable? Is 2 days reasonable? Is 6 days reasonable? But after, if he'd done it 10 or 11 times, like we talked about it before, now he's got some data and he can say, well, you know what? It's reasonable that this thing should take, more than 2 days, but it's not reasonable that it should take longer than 8 days, and by looking at that age, how long we've been working on something, that's how we're going to get that proactive signal that, what, something's not quite right here. And we need to do something about it. So for me, the biggest bang for the buck, just in getting started with this thing, totally agree with Marcus, by the way, really, really easy to get started. Once you get started, the very first thing I would look at is age.
Absolutely. Great insight as well. And maybe some of our listeners will be able to go to their tool of preference and look at the item age and maybe start asking themselves, is this a signal that something is going wrong? And of course, check out ActionableAgile. If you use some of the tools that ActionableAgile support, you get a lot of that for free. All right, we're almost over, gentlemen. But before we go, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing? Marcus.
Yeah, so I'm blogging at marcussoft.net, and that's also my Twitter handle everywhere. I was planning for Microsoft to buy that domain from me for a huge amount of money, but I have actually asked them, and they were like, buddy, keep it. So yeah. So that it's just stuck now. The most work that I do nowadays is around the training new developers. So you will find stuff that we do there on salt.dev as well, which is our site for that. So
very much, and the links will be on the show notes. Dan, where can we find you?
Probably for current thinking on stuff, the best place is probably the podcast that I run called Drunk Agile, which, by the way, open invitation, Vasco and you, Marcus. I'd love to have you on either together or individually. We should have you on, as long as you're whiskey drinkers. Actually, you can drink whatever you want. We really don't care. We don't discriminate that way. So Drunk Agile, there's a YouTube channel. Drunk Agile, you can find us at most podcast platforms, some not included anymore. And also the work that we're doing with prokanban.org. So if you haven't heard about ProKanban, check out what we're doing there. But those two things probably take up most of my time right now, and where you can find me hanging out.
Thank you very much, both of you, Dan Vacanti and Marcus Hammarberg, for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Vasco. This was a lot of fun.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.